The traditional location of Mount Sinai in Egypt is being challenged by evidence found in Saudi Arabia, in the ancient region of Midian, near Jabal. In Al-Naz, archaeologists are investigating a cemetery that some believe to be the burial site of Israelites after the Golden Calf incident. For a long time, the Saudi government kept this area under strict military control and surrounded it with barbed wire, preventing any scientific exploration. However, the scenario has recently changed with the use of drones equipped with ground-penetrating sensors. The mapping has revealed surprising artificial structures underground, such as rectangular rooms and organized passages that defy natural geological explanations.
If confirmed, this data could validate the biblical account of the Exodus and descriptions of where Moses supposedly received the tablets of the law, suggesting that the sacred mountain is in Saudi territory and not Egyptian territory. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. This calls into question more than a millennium and a half of tradition.
Since the 6th century, with the construction of the monastery of St. Catherine by Justinian, Jebel Musa in Egypt has been the destination of millions of faithful and the official version in history and religious books. However, the new findings indicate that we may be facing the biggest geographical location error in religious history, revealing secrets that have remained hidden for decades under the watchful eye of the Saudi desert. The location has become so firmly established that questioning it seems almost heretical. But here's the problem that nobody wants to discuss. The evidence doesn't match, not even close. The Bible describes Mount Sinai as a place of fire and smoke. The burning bush mentioned in the Bible, where God speaks to Moses, although the fire has already gone out and the bush is no longer speaking to anyone today, its very existence seems miraculous. When God descended upon it, the mountain burned. The ground trembled violently. The smoke rose like that of a furnace. The entire peak was engulfed by something that can only be described as a volcanic fury. Now observe Jebel Musa. It is made of granite, solid, stable granite, geologically inactive. Geologists have analyzed every inch of it. There is no evidence of volcanic activity, no burnt rock, no thermal damage, nothing to explain the cataclysmic events described in Exodus. And then there's the geographical problem. According to the biblical account, the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and traveled through a region called Midian before reaching the mountain of God. And here's the point about Midian that scholars have known for centuries but conveniently ignored. Midian was not located in Egypt. It was located east of the Gulf of Aqaba, that is, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. The Israelites' destination was Midian, which corresponds to modern-day Saudi Arabia. Therefore, Midian was in Saudi Arabia, not the Sinai Peninsula. The route described in Exodus leads directly away from the Sinai Peninsula and toward the Arabian Desert. The fixation of Mount Sinai in Egypt for over a millennium and a half stems from a mixture of political expediency and religious fervor. In the 4th century, with the legalization of Christianity in the Roman Empire, a massive demand arose for sacred sites that would serve as proof for the scriptures. When monks identified an Egyptian mountain as Sinai, the church and Emperor Justinian consolidated this version with the construction of the monastery of St. Catherine. Questioning this location became taboo, as it would challenge centuries of tradition, power, and economic influence, leading scholars to ignore geographical inconsistencies to maintain established dogma. Meanwhile, in northwestern Saudi Arabia, the Jabal Peak al-Lawz remained a strong alternative candidate, supported by local Bedouin traditions and more accurate biblical descriptions. However, the Saudi government maintained the area under strict military isolation, barring archaeologists and curious onlookers for decades. Access was so restricted that only clandestine images and accounts from adventurers fueled theories that the true Exodus site was there, hidden behind barbed wire and armed patrols. The major turning point came in 2025, when technology broke through the diplomatic blockade. Through an agreement that dispensed with physical excavations, a drone equipped with state-of-the-art ground-penetrating radar, capable of mapping through dozens of meters of rock, flew over the region. This tool, usually reserved for military purposes, made it possible to generate three-dimensional images of underground structures, revealing what the Saudi soil had kept secret for centuries and offering a new perspective on the true geography of faith. The team planned the flight route over Jabal. Laws launched the drone and waited for the data to return. What appeared on the screens left the entire laboratory silent. The radar detected structures, not natural caves, not geological fissures, man-made structures. Rectangular chambers arranged in grid patterns beneath the surface, walls that meet at perfect 90-degree angles, corridors connecting rooms in layouts that appear planned, deliberate, architectural. You don't find right angles in nature. Erosion creates curves. Tectonic movements generate chaos. But the images showed order, the kind of order that only arises from human construction or something beyond human explanation. Depth measurements indicated that these chambers were about 12 meters below the current surface, buried by millennia of landslides, erosion, and the slow accumulation of desert sand. Sealed, intact, waiting to be found. But the real shock was the scale. This wasn't a small shelter or a single room. The radar detected a network of cameras that stretched for more than 90 meters. If this complex were laid out on the surface, it would be approximately the size of a football field, large enough to house thousands of people, large enough to match the biblical description of 600,000 men plus women and children gathered at the foot of God's mountain. The team ran the scans 3 times. They checked for interference. They recalibrated each sensor. The data remained consistent. Something enormous is buried beneath that mountain. And it has been there since the time of Moses. The evidence is carved in stone. The underground chambers were just the beginning. When the radar data came to light, researchers began to re-examine old accounts of people who had managed to visit Jabal. Laws before the restrictions. What they documented corresponds to the biblical account with disturbing accuracy. Starting from the top, the rock at the summit of Jabal. Laws is black. Yes, we are once again on top of Mount Sinai, and here is a darkened block of stone. It's not a blackness caused by time, nor by lichens or mineral deposits. It's a burnt black, as if the stone itself had been subjected to intense heat. All the other mountains around are light granite, in shades of beige and gray, a common desert rock. But this particular peak appears to have been placed inside a furnace. Geologists who analyzed samples found evidence of thermal metamorphism. The rock was altered by temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. This is hotter than flowing lava. It's the kind of heat generated by a catastrophic fire or an explosive event of unimaginable scale. Exodus chapter 19 describes exactly that. We are about 6 kilometers from Jabal al-Naz, in Saudi Arabia, in the ancient land of Midian. This mountain may be the real Mount Sinai. One piece of circumstantial evidence is a cemetery currently being excavated by Japanese archaeologists, which may be the site where approximately 3,000 Israelites were buried after worshipping the golden calf. They were killed there. For decades, however, a mountain in Saudi Arabia remained isolated, surrounded by armed guards, barbed wire, and silence, treated as a military zone and removed from scientific curiosity. The hypothesis is clear. The real Mount Sinai is not in Egypt, but in Saudi Arabia. So, what was being protected? In 2025, this silence began to crumble when a drone was authorized to fly over the area, equipped with technology capable of seeing through rock. What it revealed surprised the researchers: perfectly rectangular chambers, geometric patterns, and underground rooms, organized with a precision impossible to explain by natural processes. Coincidence? What's most unsettling is the location, which coincides with ancient descriptions of the mountain where Moses stood before God and received the 10 Commandments, a central point in the tradition of Western civilization. If this data is real, it's not just archaeology, but possible evidence that the Exodus really happened. This brings us to the greatest deviation in religious history. For over 1,500 years, millions of pilgrims traveled to Jebel Musa in Egypt, believing that Mount Sinai was located there. At the base of the mountain is the famous monastery of St. Catherine, built in the 6th century by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The tradition became so entrenched that any questioning seemed almost heretical. But there's a problem. The evidence doesn't match. The Bible describes Sinai as a place of fire, smoke, and intense tremors, with its summit engulfed in something resembling a volcanic fury. Jebel Musa, on the other hand, is composed of stable, geologically inactive granite. There are no signs of volcanic activity, nor any traces of extreme heat to explain the events described in Exodus. Furthermore, there is the geographical problem. The biblical account states that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and went through Midian before reaching the mountain of God. And Midian was not in Egypt, but east of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. The route described in Exodus points directly to Arabia, not to the Sinai Peninsula. So how was the wrong place accepted for so long? The answer involves politics, power, and tradition. In the 4th century, with Christianity newly legalized in the Roman Empire, pilgrimage gained momentum. The faithful sought sacred places, and the church needed to provide them. When monks identified a mountain in Egypt as Mount Sinai, the idea was quickly formalized, especially after the construction of the monastery by Justinian. The tradition became established and was defended for centuries. Meanwhile, another mountain remained ignored, Jabal al-Lawz in northwestern Saudi Arabia. For decades, some researchers suggested that this might be the true Mount Sinai. The geography matched, and local Bedouin tribes had called the site Mountain of Moses for generations. However, the region was restricted, with a military presence, armed patrols, and a ban on access for archaeologists and film crews. Everything changed with the advancement of technology. In 2025, a team obtained authorization to conduct an overflight with a drone, equipped with ground-penetrating radar. This technology allows mapping structures up to about 30 meters deep and generating three-dimensional images. The results were impressive. The radar revealed artificial structures, rectangular chambers, organized corridors, and walls forming perfect 90-degree angles. Unlike nature, which tends to create irregular shapes, the data showed a clear pattern of deliberate construction. These structures were buried about 12 meters deep, preserved under layers accumulated over millennia. And it wasn't a small space. The complex stretched for more than 90 meters, with dimensions comparable to a football field, large enough to house thousands of people, as described in the biblical account. The tests were repeated several times, with recalibration of the equipment and verification of interference. The result remained the same. There is something enormous buried under that mountain, possibly dating back to the time of Moses. And that was just the beginning. With the release of the data, researchers began to re-evaluate old accounts from visitors who had been in the region before the restrictions. These records reveal even more intriguing details. At the top of Jabal al-Lawz, the rock is black, not from natural weathering, lichens, or minerals, but with the appearance of having been burned. While the surrounding mountains are light granite, this peak seems to have been exposed to extreme heat. Geological analyses indicate thermal metamorphism, with temperatures exceeding 1,000 °C, higher than flowing lava. This type of heat only occurs in intense events, such as catastrophic fires or large-scale explosive phenomena. Interestingly, Exodus chapter 19 describes exactly this scenario, but it's a possibility that can't be ruled out. Even without the ark, the implications are impressive. Someone invested an enormous amount of time, labor, and resources to build underground chambers at the base of a burnt mountain in the middle of the Arabian desert. The only explanation that fits all the evidence is the same one recorded in Exodus thousands of years ago. This is the mountain where Moses received the law. This is the place where fire came down from heaven. It was here that the covenant between God and humanity was sealed. The sacred memory. There's something most people simply don't realize, and it completely changes how we understand this discovery. The Bible suggests that Mount Sinai was already sacred even before Moses set foot there. Think about that for a moment. In Exodus chapter 3, when Moses first encounters the burning bush, God tells him to take off his sandals because the ground beneath his feet is holy. Not that he would become a saint after that encounter. Not that God was making him a saint at that moment. The ground was already holy. Holiness existed before the arrival of Moses. This single detail carries enormous implications. Moses didn't stumble upon some unknown peak in the desert. He was drawn to a place that already held spiritual significance, a mountain already recognized as sacred ground. But sacred to whom? It is here that the Midianites they enter the story. Remember that Moses lived among the Midianites for 40 years before the burning bush episode. He married a Midianite woman named Zipporah. His father-in-law, Jethro, was a Midianite priest. Moses spent 4 decades immersed in the culture. Midianite, herding sheep in their territory, learning their customs and almost certainly absorbing their religious traditions. If the Midianites considered a certain mountain sacred, Moses would have known it. He would have understood the importance of that place, and when God called him to that mountain, he would have recognized exactly where he was being summoned. Archaeological research in the region around Jabal al-Lawz strongly reinforce this interpretation. Researchers have discovered extensive Midianite settlements in the surrounding valleys. They found characteristic Midianite pottery, decorated with geometric patterns dating from the late Bronze Age. They also located copper smelting areas, where the Midianites processed ore extracted from nearby mines. Furthermore, they mapped evidence of organized trade networks that connected this region to Egypt, the Levant, and the rest of the ancient world. The Midianites were not primitive nomads wandering aimlessly through the desert. They were a sophisticated people with established territories, religious practices, and cultural traditions passed down through generations. They knew every peak in that landscape, and they certainly attributed meaning to even the most unusual ones. And Jabal al-Lawz is profoundly unusual. A darkened peak rising above neighboring mountains in shades of beige and gray would require an explanation. A split rock showing evidence of water in a region without water would inspire stories. The Midianites would have developed traditions around such features long before any Israelites arrived there. The mountain carried sacred memory before Moses, and this memory created a continuous thread linking the past to the present. This continuity of sacred memory is fundamental to understanding why the true location was preserved, while the false one was invented. The people who lived near Jabal al-Lawz in Arabia never forgot. Generation after generation, fathers told their sons, mothers told their daughters, elders told their children. The mountain of Moses, the place where the fire descended, the ground where God spoke. For them, this was not abstract theology. It was local geography. It was part of the landscape in which they lived. They passed through there. They pointed to her. They kept that memory alive for thousands of years through an unbroken oral tradition. Meanwhile, some 2,400 kilometers away in Egypt, Byzantine monks were only speculating. They had no connection to the original tradition. They had no access to living memory. They had texts, legends, and political motivations, but they lacked the continuous thread that linked them to real events. The choice of Jabal Musa as Mount Sinai was, to a large extent, a construct of theological convenience. By officially designating the location, monks and imperial authorities imposed a sacred geography that served the political and pilgrimage needs of the time, even without concrete evidence. For centuries, Western academia preferred to rely on this institutional authority and late written records, dismissing as mere folklore the oral traditions of the Bedouin tribes inhabiting the Jabal region. Al-Lawz, and who have preserved this memory for hundreds of generations. This intellectual stance revealed an arrogance that prioritized diplomas and institutions over indigenous knowledge and the direct connection of local inhabitants to the land. However, recent technological data is bringing about a turnaround. Radar confirms the existence of artificial structures and chambers beneath the Saudi soil, validating the persistent memory of the desert peoples. What was once labeled superstition is now proving to be the most accurate historical record available. Confirmation that the standards under Jabal al, laws is deliberate and intentional actions, place humanity before a profound dilemma. If these chambers are opened and reveal evidence of the biblical past, we will not only have a new archaeological discovery, but a rupture in the way we understand history and faith. Maps and beliefs would need to be redrawn. In the end, technology has given us the outline of the mystery. But the crucial question is not about the ability to excavate, but about our readiness to deal with the impact of the truth that may emerge from these depths.